Alright, drywall repairman here. We're just fixing a big scuff in a wall. Believe it or not, this was from a reclining chair. Broke and it went into the wall. So the first thing we're going to do is mask off the baseboard. Sometimes the baseboard's dusty, so I like to wipe it away, de-dust it so the masking tape will stick. We're going to put down some masking tape and then we're going to add some plastic to the masking tape. Basically to contain the area. If you don't have plastic, you can use an old tarp, an old sheet, anything you have just to contain your mess. Sheetrock tear out, mudding is a messy procedure. So we want to try to catch all of our mess. Basically you can do two ways here. You can cut out one large section like a 2 foot by 3 foot, 2 foot by 4 foot section. Or you could just cut out each little patch and patch it in. What I like to do is use a straight edge, like a piece of wood, a level, anything you got, ruler, straight piece of wood. I like to go to the sides and just mark it with my pencil. Try to get as square as possible. You're not going to be precise. If you want to be precise, then you can bust out the tape measure and measure right on the money. But we're just cutting out a square area, and I'm going to use my razor blade, and I'm just going to score the lines that I created with the pencil. You're not going to go all the way through the sheetrock with the razor. You could score it 1 or 2 times. That way you could just snap back the sheetrock. If you don't have a sheetrock razor, you can also cut it back with a keyhole saw, sawzall, but a simple razor, sheetrock razor, is the easiest way of cutting out patches like this. I'm just going to cut out a square patch here, like a 1 foot by 1.5 foot patch, and then the smaller patch on the bottom, just going to cut it out. It'd probably actually be easier if I just cut out a whole section and redid it, but we're just going to cut out these 2 small patch areas. Once you get the sheetrock patches all cut out, nice and square, cleaned up, now you're ready to add backing. If you're next to a stud, of course, cut back to the center of the stud so you can have something to screw the new sheetrock and the old sheetrock to. If you're not next to a stud, then it's okay. You can add the backing in. I like to use these 1x1s, 1x2 thin pieces of wood. These thin pieces of wood fit inside the wall. If the wall depth isn't there for a 2x4, these nice thin pieces of wood work perfect for backing. There's also backing clips, 1x1s, 1x2s, 2x4s, anything you can really use. The whole goal with it is to get something to screw the sheetrock to. You can't just put the patch in there and catch one screw in it, then it'll wibble wobble. So with all patches, you're going to need a piece of wood on each side, or at least top and bottom, both sides to put screws into so the patch doesn't wibble wobble. And we like to get the screws on that outside edge in the old sheetrock and in the new sheetrock so it tightens up both areas. If you don't put these backing in, you just use an old stud and it wibble wobbles, it's a good chance it's going to crack out. So that's why we like to add backing on both sides, up and down. In the ideal world, you want 1 on each side and 1 on the top, 1 on the bottom, but 2 on the side for these smaller patches. 1 up and down is good enough. If you had a big board, you can do 1 long diagonal board on a smaller patch, but a bigger patch over 1.5, 2x2, you want to get 1 on each side. But go ahead and add your backing, add a couple screws in. 1 screw in your backing ain't going to do it. You're going to have to add at least 2 screws. This patch to the right of it is a stud. I could have cut back to the stud to stud, but then I'd have a bigger patch, twice as big patch. So that's why we had the backing. But I'm going to add a couple screws in the existing framing. This is going to tighten up the area because it got pushed in when they created the damage in the wall. It also pushed in the sheetrock and it caused nail pops, screw pops. So I'm going to add a couple screws in the side right here to the right side to tighten it up. And then we're going to get this backing installed and take our measurements. I always use this measurement technique because I'm inside a house and the sheetrock's outside of my truck. So I always take my measurements and I write them down on a piece of tape, or you can use a scrap piece of sheetrock and write down your measurements. And then you could take that measurements to where you're going and cut them out. If you try to remember the measurements, you might have a good memory and you can remember. But with me, I like to write them down so when I go to the truck, I remember them and then I can cut them out right then and there instead of trying to haul a big chunk of sheetrock inside someone's house and cutting it down right there. So just leave the mess by the work area outside by the truck. So go ahead and take your measurements and now you're ready to cut your sheetrock pieces. Alright, install your sheetrock, add plenty of screws. I like to get a couple screws on each side of it where the backing is. Now you see why we added the backing. Now you have something to screw the sheetrock to. You could always cut it from stud to stud on left to right, but then like I said, you're going to have a very large patch. Maybe even this job I should have just did a larger section, but we're gonna sheetrock it, tape it, and mud and texture this whole area anyways. So I'm just patching in what needs to be patched up, and you'll be surprised what mudding and texturing can do. You can mud and texture anything pretty much. So we're just patching in the areas. Your patches also, you try to get them as perfect as possible. You're not going to be exactly tight. You will have gaps. It's okay if you have gaps. Before you do any taping, you just scrape the areas, and then we could always pre-fill the gaps. If there's big gaps. Rule of thumb for gaps, if I could stick my pinky in there, it's going to need to pre-fill. If it's smaller than your pinky, then you can go ahead and tape over it and then pre-fill over the tape with the fiberglass, and you'll see how I do that on here. But get everything secured. Make sure all your screws are set deep, and then go ahead and scrape everything with the 6-inch knife. You have to scrape this. This just knocks off any goobers, any high spots. Spray glue. Spray glue is an optional item. The only reason I use this is because of mesh tape. It's sticky, but sometimes it doesn't like to stick to old walls, old dusty walls. It likes to stick to brand new sheetrock, but repairs like this, it doesn't like to stick to old dusty painted walls. So I just do a little bit of spray glue. I'm not saturating the area, I'm just giving enough to give the tape to bond to. If I didn't use spray glue, I can put the tape on and more likely it's going to stay, but sometimes I walk away to go mix mud and I come back and all my tape fell off. And it's kind of frustrating when you're sitting there with a pan in one hand and a knife in the other ready to coat, but all your tape fell down, so then you have to put everything down and push it against the wall. Sometimes you can also put a little bit of mud on the wall and then the tape will stick to your mud and follow through with the coat. But I just use this spray glue. It's an optional thing. I like to use it. It's not the cheapest stuff. It's usually $10 or more a can, but I just use it sparingly and it lasts me a long time on these jobs. Also, your fiberglass. I always use fiberglass on repairs. I know there's so many stuff on YouTube videos, people telling you the newest, greatest, best, most improved item to use. Those are all fine and dandy. If you're comfortable using them, go ahead and use them. But regular fiberglass mesh tape is the go-to item. People could say this, can say that, but I can tell you I've been in business for over 12 years. I've been doing drywall for 25 plus years. We always use the basic good old-fashioned fiberglass. I've never had any callbacks. If you're trying to tape an area with a gap that you're not comfortable or like, ooh, that might crack out, just go ahead and do a double layer or triple layer of fiberglass mesh tape over it to peace of mind. But this fiberglass is strong stuff. It's one of the best in the market. And I've never had a re-crack out or a callback from a stress crack from using fiberglass mesh tape. So that's why I don't try to use other brands, other stuff that's out there, the new and improved stuff. I'm sure they're great, but just stick to your fiberglass mesh tapes on all these jobs. A lot of people use paper tapes. You don't use paper tapes for repairs, I'm sorry to tell you. Paper tapes are meant for angles, maybe fire taping, more for taping large projects. 1, 10, 20, 100 sheet type jobs. But patchwork, just stick to your fiberglass mesh tape. Once you get it all fiberglass mesh tape, now you're ready to first coat. If there's any boogers or any little pieces of fiberglass, go ahead and take those out. It's easier to mess with it now before you get mud on it. Also, fiberglass, I like to push down with my 6-inch knife. Push it down nice and flat. I don't want any waves in the fiberglass mesh tape, so you want it to sit flat on the work area. If it's peeling up and won't stay still, then that's what that spray glue is for. Like in the bottom right here, I'm spraying a little more because that fiberglass doesn't like to stick to dusty sheetrock, old walls. This is a very dirty wall. This is also a corner bead spray glue made by 3M. It's meant for corner bead. That's why it sprays at a pink pigment. There's also clear 77 3M glue that works pretty good. But I just stick to the 3M glues. There's a ton of spray glues out there. Like I said, I'm not saturating the wall with it. I'm just using it more of a bonder, just so that tape can stay on. The mud is what does the sealing and everything. This is just to hold my tape on the wall on the dusty areas. Get everything pressed down. Only use fiberglass mesh tape. Spray glue is optional. Alright, so now once you get these patched in like this, you're ready for a first coat. First coats, I use joint compounds, or you can use a quickset mud. I'm going to use a quickset mud because I got to get this job finished. Back at the truck. We don't need no more tools. Put those away. 5 minutes. This is the type I like to use. They have others on the market. If you're able to get this stuff, if you are going to use a 5-minute quickset mud, I like to use this stuff. The other stuffs are good. This is just what I like to use. I never have any issues with this type of mud. Never had any cracks, callbacks, stress cracks reappearing with stuff like this. I've been in business for 12 years. Been doing drywall for 25 plus years. But this is a product I like to use. If you're able to get it, awesome. Whatever other brand you can get, I'm sure is just as good. It's just a fast setting. It sets up 5 minutes, so you got to work quickly with it. It's a powder form. It just comes in like a flour. It's almost as thin as a flour, powder form. I don't need much mud, but basically we're just going to add fresh water. Always have a bucket with fresh water whenever you're working with materials. I'm sure this is the same with every trade. Cement, painting, everything. Fresh water for a new job. I use my 6-inch knife, just mix it up. I'm just tossing it around, just stirring it around, nothing special. Everybody has these special tools and gimmicks, but you're just mixing it in the pan. Any extra water you could just dump in your bucket. But let's go ahead and get this mixed up thick, nice thick, mixed up, nice and creamy. Let's mix it up. Mixed up really thick. Coating knife. Some guys like to use 10 inches, 12 inches, 14 inches. I like to just use a regular 12-inch knife and a 6-inch knife for my go-to knives, and a pan. Some guys like to use hock and trowels, but on this region we use pans and knives like this. Alright, with the first coat I'm using a quickset mud, that 5-minute mud. What I like to do is use my 6-inch knife. I'm going to strike in the tape. What this does, it pushes the tape down, gets it really in the grooves and the gap. There's a little gap in the sheetrock, so that pushes the mud inside the gap, inside the fiberglass mesh. You're pushing the materials, getting it pushed down. This is an important step because you're getting that materials pushed inside the wall and the gaps, sealing everything up. You could go ahead and just coat over it without doing this process, but just striking it in, you're getting that materials pushed in. Nice strong hold, nice strong patch. Then I'm just going to coat the area. I'm using a 5-minute mud using a 12-inch knife, and I'm just doing a coat. I like to put all my mud on the area. Just basically use up the mud in my pan. And then I turn around and I like to feather it off. Feather the edges. Use the corner of your knife and you're just feathering off the edges. You're just feathering it off so it blends in. And then you could trowel it down, up or down, whatever way you want to coat. This way I'm just going to go right down the middle, and then I'm going to feather the sides again. Feather the sides. That's a good first coat. If you're using a joint compound, you'd have to let this dry overnight. I'm using a 5-minute mud, so I'm going to have to let this set up for about 5 minutes or so. If you mix extra mud, go ahead and dump out your mud. You don't want this mud drying in your pan. If it's joint compound, you can turn around and reuse your joint compound, but you want to put it back in the bucket and reuse it the next day. Hot muds, once you mix it up, they're going to set up in that time frame, either a 5-minute, 20-minute, 40-minute, or 90-minute, depending on the type of hot mud you use. So go ahead and dump it and clean up your tools as this coat process sets up. Gives you plenty of time to clean your tools and set up for your next step. So go ahead and clean up your tools right away after coating.
The work truck. If you don't have a hose hookup and a spigot, then go ahead and just use your bucket to clean up your tools. Sponge, clean up all your tools right away. You don't want this mud caking up, drying on your tools. So let's go ahead and clean up these tools. All cleaned up. We're just going to let that mud set up for a couple minutes. Our next step, we're going to have to slick it out with a sponge and a 6-inch knife. But before I go up there, I'm going to mix a little more 5-minute mud to second coat it because it is upstairs, so I don't want to have to come back and forth to the truck. So we're going to slick it out, and then I'm going to follow through with a tight second coat. But let's give that mud some minutes to dry, and then we'll go upstairs and get a second coat. Couple minutes. Let's go ahead and mix up some more 5-minute mud. Mixed up. I don't need as much mud as the first coat. A little thinner because it is a second coat, skim coat. So let's go ahead upstairs, slick it out, and then we're going to follow it through with a quick, tight second coat.
All right, now the first coat's starting to set up. We're going to slick it out. This is a technique used with only hot muds. It's a 5-minute mud, so it's been about 5 minutes, 4 to 5 minutes. It's starting to set up, so it's not fully dry. It's starting to set up, so this is the time you slick out and manipulate it like I am doing. I like to take the sponge and get rid of that edge, feather out the edge. That's the most important part. You don't want to see that edge under the texture. And then we're just basically following through with a clean 6-inch knife and taking the extra mud off. What this is doing, I'm pushing down. I'm taking off the extra material. It's filling in the deep areas and we're taking off the extra material. I'd compare this to like working with clay or cements. As the material starts setting up with those, you also manipulate the materials. So we're manipulating the materials slicking it out, taking off the extra materials. If you do this correctly, it almost looks like a second coat once you're finished. This is a slick out technique. It's only done with hot muds. With joint compounds, you're going to have to let it dry overnight and sand it in between coats. Hot muds are the slick out technique. Now I got my second coat mud already mixed up. I'm just going to follow through. I'm going to coat it the opposite direction. You don't necessarily have to do this way, go in the opposite direction, but it helps get rid of any chatters and goobers, any fill-ins. Sometimes going up and down, you'll cross it off like this and you'll fill in the opposite direction. So it makes a nice patch when you go the opposite direction between coats. I'm not leaving the mud on super heavy either. I'm kind of doing almost a skim coat. This is a hot mud. It's not like a regular joint compound. Joint compounds you always put on heavier because they shrink back as they dry, and you always can sand down the excess. With hot muds, they don't shrink back. They go on however you put it on. So we're not trying to put a big old hump patch on the wall, big old heavy hump on the wall. So we're just putting on nice tight coats. And then we're going to slick out in between coats to take off the extra. By slicking out in between coats, just by doing 2 coats of hot mud, slicking it out in between, it's almost like 4 coats of mud.
Mud sets up. I'm going to go ahead and get my texture ready. I use joint compounds for top coat or texture. Never use hot muds for texture because they are a rougher material. This material's I had from the other day, so go ahead and mix it up. Always whip up your mud before you use it. Creamy, heavy pancake batter is the consistency of most, if not all, textures. It's a hand texture, so I'm just going to get what I need, scoop it up with my 6 and put it in my pan. I don't need much texture. Our second coat's setting up, so our next step, we're going to slick it out.
Alright, once the second coat starts setting up like this, same thing as before. We're going to slick it out. I'm going to go over the edges, take the damp sponge. I'm just going over it. I'm not saturating the wall with water. I'm just moistening it. This helps the knife to glide over it and slick out better. That's the definition of slicking out, what we're doing here. Also use the straight part of your knife. If you look at your knives, down the knife, you're going to notice there's always a curvature to your knife. The curve out goes towards the wall. The curve in goes towards your fingers. Your fingers are the steering wheel for these knives. As you can tell by watching my knife, it's kind of in the middle to the top. I'm basically steering the pressure. I'm putting the pressure on the knife how I want the mud to flow. There's really no way of explaining this. It just takes practice of using knives. That's why I always recommend, instead of buying a bunch of knives, just use a 6-inch knife and maybe a 10 or a 12-inch knife. Those are the only 2 knives you need to have. Until you can master those 2 knives, you shouldn't have any other knives. That works with drywallers. They have 2-inch, 4-inch, 6-inch, 8-inch, 10-inch, 12-inch, 14-inch, 16-inch, 18, 20, 24-inch. They have 100 different knives, but guess what? Those drywallers can't even use one of them. So let's master 1 or 2 knives before we spend a lot of money buying all these other knives. You'd be surprised what a 6-inch knife and a 12-inch knife can do. Believe it or not, I only have a 6-inch, a 12-inch, and a 24-inch knife in my truck and some little putty knives. That's all I carry with me. 14-inch knives work good too, but those are a little more professional grade to learn how to steer. After I got it all slicked out, the second coat, I'm going to follow through with the Santa Fe. Santa Fe is nothing. It's easy to put on. It's not a perfect smooth. There are some imperfections, skip trowel in it. So I kind of like put it on like with some skip trowel and then I just trowel it down. I'm going to go the horizontal direction with this because it's easier to work with the knives with the muds when you go horizontal versus vertical. So I'm just basically crossing off my whole patch with this skim coat with this joint compound. That's just a nice finish. I used hot muds to do the first coat, hot mud the second coat. I'm not going to use a hot mud this texture. Hot muds are more coarse and gritty. I like to always do my last coat with a joint compound. All my textures are joint compound. All my skim finishes are joint compound. Santa Fe's like this one that are just basically a skim coat done with the joint compounds. Joint compounds, let them dry overnight. Once you let them dry, you can turn around and sand a joint compound with 150 to 220 grit sandpaper, then primer, then paint. You got a perfect patch right here from a scuff from a chair. Chair leaned back and broke and it fell into the wall, and then they had to fix it. So that's what we did here. These two little small patches I did in here turned into one large 2 by 4 foot area. You could also, instead of doing my little patch technique, doing 2 small patches, you could have did 1 larger patch. That would have been fine. But we basically got this done. Pull your masking too. Never leave your masking overnight. You say, oh, well, I got to paint tomorrow, so I'm just going to leave the masking. No, just pull your masking, remask for the next step tomorrow. The masking sometimes has mud on it, and then you go pull it back the next day, and it rips and tears your texture along with it. So that's why we always pull the texture. Also, keep your cutout piece from your demo that you can use for a paint match. I always try to give my customers a piece of the sheetrock that I cut out so they can paint match it. This really makes their day and makes it easier for them to do a paint match. But I hope this video was helpful. Please like and subscribe.